Have you seen any squirrels? Hi, I'm Lou and this is Lily Rowe. So part of the Forest School Level 3 leadership course in the UK is to explore and compare and contrast different woodland types. So we thought we'd make this video and we're in a non-native coniferous plantation, and we thought we'd share with you some of the features of this woodland type. Yeah, as it is a common woodland type that you might find in the UK. So let's start by exploring some of the definitions of the words that we've used. As I said, we're in a non-native coniferous plantation. So non-native, meaning that the species of tree here are not ones that you would naturally find in the UK. They've been brought here by humans. Coniferous, meaning the cone-bearing group of trees that are kind of evolutionarily older than the broadleaf species. And then plantation, meaning that it has been planted specifically. Yeah, it's been planted specifically by humans as a crop. Just to mention, of course, you can get coniferous natural woodlands. Not where I live in Norfolk in the UK, that wouldn't be a natural thing, but up in the Highlands of Scotland, for example, you may well have natural coniferous woodlands. And equally, you could get broadleaf species. Sorry about that. Lily Rowe tripped over a massive stick that she brought over. I think I was saying that you can get, natural coniferous woodlands, and likewise you can also get broadleaf plantations as well. So it's not always a coniferous plantation. And of course you could have either of those with native species as well as non-native species. But today we are at Bacton Woods, which is owned by the Forestry Commission, and the Forestry Commission is kind of the government department responsible for growing trees really and looking after the UK's woodland that is the publicly owned woodland. And the Forestry Commission was set up after the First World War to make sure that we would always have a stock of timber in this country, because during the wars, both the First and Second World War, we ran out of wood, and that's obviously quite a vulnerable position to be in when you're at war. And so historically, the Forestry Commission sites tend to use fast-growing non-native coniferous species to create nice timber products. And to make nice timber products, ideally the trees need to be nice and straight. So they plant them all in straight lines quite close together so that they'll compete. They'll compete with the light and grow up really quickly. So we found an area of spruce trees, and with plantations they do tend to be often just single species blocks, which I guess is to do with the efficiency of harvesting them. If you know that they're all spruce trees in this block, when it comes to kind of chopping them down and processing them to sell, it's a lot easier if it's all just one species. And they've all been planted in rows, as I said, and quite densely packed. So in terms of the horizontal structure, it's quite a tight, closed canopy. So it's a blazing sunny spring day today, but we're in constant shade. It's a lot darker under here than it is out along the pathways and under other sections of the woodlands. So this dense horizontal structure in the plantation affects the vertical structure. And what we see if you look around this woodland is that there's only really a canopy layer at the top and a ground layer at the bottom, and nothing really in between. There's no understory, and there's no ground flora, no field layer. No field layer above. And that's because most coniferous species, such as spruce, are evergreen species, meaning that they have their needles on all year round. So there's never a point of the year that the light will reach the forest floor. So that means other species can't grow underneath the canopy because there's not enough light. So it means that you have a very limited vertical structure, just the canopy and the ground. So as I was saying, not a lot grows underneath the evergreen canopy. As I look around, there's really no plants at all apart from mosses, and I suspect there might be some fungi as well in the autumn time, but there's no vascular plants growing under here. The exception to this is as you reach the edge of the block, once you come out onto the edges where the horizontal, no, Bubba, no. I'm afraid Bubba has broken the stick that the camera was on, and the microphone has run out of battery, and we'll do the best we can with what we've got left. But we did just hear an owl, which is quite exciting because it's the middle of the afternoon. We did hear an owl going woo, so that's good. I think I was saying that basically not a lot is growing out here because the canopy is so thick, and so as I'm looking here, there are no vascular plants growing. There is just a bit of moss occasionally strewn around, but most of it is just the needles of the forest floor. There's not much at all growing here. Speaking of the forest floor, so another aspect of the coniferous trees is that because they're not native, there aren't many species that have evolved along with them to break up the needles, and so that means it takes a very, very long time for them to be broken down and turned back into soil. So you've got years and years and years, layers of needles all stacked on the forest floor. And this means that the floor is very spongy. I guess if you've ever been into a coniferous woodland, you'll know what I mean. There's a spring in your step as you walk through the woodland. It's very springy, almost like a woodland trampoline. You feel like you want to boing up and down on it. And that's basically, yes, up and down. And that's basically because there's years worth of needles lying around, because only a few specialised fungi can actually break it down, so it can take a very long time. I think I read somewhere that in a pine woodland it takes like 7 years for the needles to break down, because that's how long it takes for the fungi to do that. Another part of this kind of soil cycle and breaking down of the needles is that it turns the soil acidic. So that also affects the potential of what can and can't grow here. So even if there was light reaching the forest floor, the acidity might mean that certain species can't grow here. You often get stuff like bracken and like more heathland species that can cope with acidity in coniferous woodland. Another thing to consider about the coniferous trees is because they're not native, they haven't got the same complex food webs and ecology around them as our native trees do, because these sorts of relationships take thousands of years to develop, or tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years to develop. And so because the tree is kind of being collected from somewhere else and plonked here, you haven't got that same biodiversity associated with it. However, that said, there are some species that might benefit from these trees. So of course they're cone bearing species, so any creatures that like to eat cones, like squirrels and small mammals, and certain bird species like crossbills and things like that are specialised to eat from cones. So there might be some species there that benefit. Also, the evergreen foliage offers all year round protection for birds nesting, and shelter over winter time where you might not want to be exposed to the elements. Then a coniferous woodland offers some shelter to the creatures. Yeah, and you know, up in Scotland, where the coniferous woodlands would be native, you have got rarer species like the pine marten, red squirrels, those kinds of species that would be very reliant on a coniferous woodland. So the last thing to consider when you're looking at a coniferous plantation is, because they're planted usually in single species blocks and they don't have the high biodiversity that perhaps a natural native woodland would have, that means that they're quite unstable in terms of a system. So what I mean by that is, if there was a pest or a disease that affected that particular tree, it would spread like wildfire because there's nothing to break up the population of trees, unlike a naturally evolved woodland. So they're all the same age, they're all really close together. You know, a disease is going to just wipe them all out. So they're not very stable as a system. So we wanted to show you another example of a coniferous woodland. So we've come over to Holt Country Park in North Norfolk, and we found a section of pine. It's a mix of Corsican and Scots pine. It looks like it was planted as a plantation. The trees are still in straight lines. However, the horizontal structure is much sparser because they've started to thin out and selectively harvest some of the trees. I'm guessing that it's probably for conservation reasons rather than for forestry, a woodland product point of view, because there's still a lot of wood stacked in the woodlands rather than being removed as a product. And so what that's meant is that now light can reach the forest floor. So you've got this dappled sunlight and certain areas that have got sunnier spots. And what you notice in this woodland is that there is some natural regeneration happening because there's some sunshine being able to get to the forest floor. So we've got bird dispersed berry bearing species cropping up. So some of them are other non-native conifers, like we have got some Douglas fir cropping up, some larch cropping up, some western red cedar even, I think there's one over there. And there are some broadleaf species such as rowan, some birch, some sweet chestnut. Holly is the main understory species, and I've also noticed a bit of non-native rhododendron cropping up too. Hello Bubs, are you awake? It's very noisy, the planes are overhead. As I was saying, the main species is holly in the understory, and there's also a bit of non-native rhododendron snuck in, I've noticed. There's also some birch and some sweet chestnuts kind of creeping in patches as well. So we're seeing natural regeneration coming through the process of succession. In terms of the soil layer, it's still going to be really acidic here because of the conifers dominating the area, and so that's going to limit the species that can grow here. So even the broadleaf native trees that are growing here, like the rowan and the birch, are species that can tolerate acidic conditions, so that until a long-term process of succession happens and these broadleaf deciduous trees start changing the soil acidity, it's unlikely that other species are going to start moving in. So it's still that sort of early stages of succession in terms of the tree life. Coming down to the ground flora, again, you're not seeing like the native woodland plant species here. It's again dominated by bracken, which can cope with acidic soils. There are also mosses and fungi kind of here, and the soil still feels very spongy underfoot. In terms of the vertical structure of the woodland, so we are seeing all four layers of the woodland present. However, as I said, they are limited based on what can cope with growing in these conditions. So unlike the woodland before, we are seeing the shrub understory layer, and we are seeing some ground flora layer as well, because of the slightly sparser canopy and the light being able to reach the forest floor. In terms of animal life here, so we've been seeing here, and we have seen grey squirrel. You can always find a squirrel in most woodlands, and there's certainly evidence around of squirrel feeding activity on all the pine cones. We've also experienced a flock of tits flying past. There were some long-tailed tits and some great tits and some blue tits in that flock as they went past. So they'll be kind of looking for insects as they kind of fly through. So there is a little bit of bird life happening. Looking at the forest floor as well, it looks like there is deer activity moving through as well. And I guess because we are seeing more broadleaf species starting to come into this woodland, there is a food source for grazing animals. So compared to the previous woodland, you could say that this coniferous woodland has got a bit more biodiversity, and in a way we're kind of seeing it transition from being a coniferous woodland and returning to what might naturally occur here through the process of succession. I guess you could say the management of this site is trying to speed that up by selectively removing certain pine trees so that that's increasing the sunlight and the natural succession processes. So we've kind of almost got a mix of coniferous and broadleaf happening in this woodland as things kind of return to what nature perhaps intended for this particular region. Do you have any thoughts about coniferous plantations? Do let us know in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this video, do give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel so that you can join us in the woods again next time. And thanks for watching. Yeah. Coniferous trees, all planted in rows, can be quite dark, so nothing will grow. Acidic soil from the needly leaves are features to look for when you head to the trees. Up.